In the sweltering Texas heat of 1981, the Rodriguez family's neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone waved from their porches and kids played freely in the front yard. It was safe, familiar, predictable, until the day it wasn't. Three identical 6-year-old brothers, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, vanished in broad daylight without a sound. One moment, their laughter filled the air. The next, the yard was empty. For 30 years, their father scanned every crowd, every passing face, waiting for the impossible. Then, at an ordinary backyard birthday gathering, a stranger arrived with a boy wearing something that froze time in its tracks. The exact kind of clothes the brothers had worn on the day they disappeared. It set in motion a chain of discoveries that would unravel decades of buried truth, suspicion, and danger, and lead to a face-to-face encounter with the man who might have been holding the answers all along. If you're ready for a story of loss, persistence, and the kind of twists you couldn't make up if you tried, stick with us. Hit like, tap subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a mystery, because what's about to unfold will keep you glued to the screen until the very last second. The summer sun bore down on a quiet Texas border town in 1981, painting long shadows across the Rodriguez family's front yard. Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel played in the dust, their identical laughter carrying into the still afternoon air. Their father, Daniel Rodriguez, leaned on the porch railing, sipping sweet tea and watching the boys invent games only triplets could understand. He could never tell exactly what they were planning, but the bond between them was unshakable. The neighborhood was familiar, dependable. Every face was known, every front door open to a neighbor in need. The streets felt safe, the kind of place where no one feared what might happen in broad daylight. That safety shattered in a moment. Daniel stepped inside for only a few minutes to answer the phone. When he returned, the yard was empty. The football they'd been tossing lay forgotten in the dirt. At first, he thought they'd wandered into the backyard. He checked behind the shed, then in the neighbor's garden, calling each of their names. Silence answered, broken only by the buzz of cicadas. Daniel's heart began to pound. He searched the street, scanning driveways and porches, hoping to see three familiar heads of dark hair bobbing toward him. But every house seemed still, the street eerily quiet. He ran to the home of his neighbor, Mark Alvarez, who immediately grabbed his truck keys. Within minutes, the two men were combing every block, shouting for the boys, knocking on doors, pounding on fences. Word spread quickly. Within the hour, half the neighborhood was outside, fanning out across streets, fields, and creek beds. The triplets' faces were burned into everyone's memory, their matching smiles impossible to mistake. Local police arrived, organizing volunteers into search parties. They brought dogs, radios, and maps, marking off grids and combing each section in methodical sweeps. The August heat bore down, but no one stopped searching. As night fell, floodlights lit the streets. The Rodriguez front yard became a staging area, radios crackling with updates, officers checking in as they scoured the surrounding countryside for any sign of the missing brothers. Daniel sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, scanning the dark. Every set of approaching headlights made his heart lurch, only to sink again when strangers stepped out, shaking their heads. The first 24 hours passed without a single clue. No one had seen the boys leave the yard. No tire marks, no dropped belongings, no sound of struggle had been reported by anyone nearby. Detectives began interviewing neighbors one by one. Each swore they'd seen the boys earlier that afternoon, running in the yard, laughing. But after a certain point, they simply vanished, as if the ground had swallowed them whole. Reporters arrived, their cameras catching the strained lines of Daniel's face as he pleaded into microphones. "Please, if anyone knows anything, come forward. They're only 6 years old. They're my whole world." Flyers went up across town, each bearing 3 identical photographs. Lucas, with his wide grin. Noah, with his thoughtful eyes. Gabriel, the smallest, with a shy half-smile. Underneath, bold letters read, "Missing. Triplets." Leads trickled in. A possible sighting at a gas station, a report of a cherry-red Cadillac cruising nearby. But each dissolved under scrutiny. Witnesses couldn't be certain. The trail went cold almost as quickly as it had begun. Days turned to weeks. Search parties grew smaller. The police kept the case open but warned Daniel that without new evidence there was little more they could do. The weight of that reality pressed heavier with each passing day, and yet Daniel refused to stop looking. Every unfamiliar car, every glimpse of dark curls in a crowd sent him moving toward it. The town returned to its routines, but for him, time had frozen on that sweltering summer afternoon. For years after the disappearance, Daniel Rodriguez woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling as the weight of 3 empty beds pressed on his chest. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, the dreams always ended the same. He saw Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel running ahead of him on a sunlit path, their laughter echoing just out of reach. No matter how fast he chased, they always disappeared around the bend. The investigation officially remained open, but in reality, momentum faded. Detectives rotated through assignments, leads dried up, and newer cases demanded attention. Daniel became the constant, the one man who refused to let the story die. In the years that followed, he learned to track down whispers, a stranger's mention of triplets in another county, a rumor about a man traveling with 3 boys. Every scrap of possibility was worth pursuing. He drove hundreds of miles on half-promises. Sometimes it was nothing more than 3 brothers walking to a park. Other times it was photographs that almost, but not quite, matched the faces etched into his memory. Neighbors eventually stopped asking for updates. Not out of cruelty, but because they feared the answer. Daniel could see the pity in their eyes, the way their voices softened when they spoke to him. Birthdays came and went. On each one, Daniel lit 3 candles on a small cake in the kitchen, speaking their names aloud before blowing the flames out. The tradition was private, a ritual of remembrance and stubborn hope. The years changed him. Lines deepened around his eyes, his hair thinned, and his back carried a permanent hunch from bending over search maps and photographs. But his resolve never weakened, not once. Every so often, police would revisit the case files, hoping that modern technology might uncover something missed. Daniel would sit with them, revisiting every detail, answering the same questions with the same unwavering determination. Sometimes, late at night, he replayed the day of the disappearance in his mind, searching for something, anything, he might have missed. The cherry-red Cadillac sighting haunted him more than any other fragment. He'd never known the owner. Some said it belonged to a man from another neighborhood. Others swore it had been seen near the school before. No record tied it to the triplets' disappearance, but Daniel never forgot it. His home became a quiet museum to the boys' lives. Toys neatly stored in boxes, clothes folded and kept, photographs framed along the hallway as if they might walk back through the door at any moment. Friends urged him to move on, to find peace, to accept the possibility that his sons might never return. Daniel listened politely, but inside, the idea was unthinkable. Surrender felt like betrayal. He stayed in the same house, on the same street, in the same neighborhood. Every corner held a memory. Every crack in the sidewalk felt like a breadcrumb leading back to the life he'd lost. When television programs about missing children aired, Daniel would call producers, offering the story, sending old photographs. Sometimes they aired the segment, other times they didn't. Each appearance sparked a brief rush of renewed hope. He learned the names of detectives who had come and gone. Some still called him from time to time, offering nothing new but checking in out of respect. They knew he would never stop searching. 3 decades passed this way. Years of scanning crowds, chasing shadows, following rumors. To outsiders, Daniel seemed like a man chasing ghosts. But to him, the search was a promise, and promises could not be broken. And so he waited, scanning every street, every photograph, every unexpected face. He had no way of knowing that the first real clue in 30 years was about to walk straight into his life. The afternoon sun poured across a modest suburban backyard just outside Laredo, Texas. Balloons bobbed in the warm breeze while neighbors gathered around folding tables heavy with food. It was Tommy Alvarez's 8th birthday, and the block was alive. Daniel Rodriguez stood near the garden fence, adjusting his cap. At 60, his frame still carried strength, but his posture bore the weight of decades spent searching, scanning crowds for faces that never appeared. Near the grill, his friend Mark chatted with several men, flipping burgers over an open flame. Daniel smiled politely, listening only halfway to small talk, his mind still caught in the undertow of old memories. Then he noticed movement by the patio door. A man he didn't recognize stepped into the yard holding the hand of a boy, no older than 8, with dark curls bouncing under the sun. "We're late," the newcomer called out with an easy smile. "Had a situation at home." The boy wriggled free, darting toward the other children, his green checkered overalls flashing bright yellow straps as he ran. Daniel's breath caught. It was the exact style his sons had worn the morning they vanished. The same pattern, same color, even the long-sleeved shirt beneath. Time seemed to fold, placing him back in 1981. Without thinking, Daniel crossed the yard quickly. His hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder, turning him around. "Where did you get those clothes?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, laced with disbelief. The boy's eyes widened. In an instant, he bolted, rushing back to the safety of the man who'd brought him. "Dad! Dad!" he cried, his voice tight with alarm. The man stepped protectively between Daniel and the boy. "Is everything okay?" His tone was cautious, his stance guarded, his gaze moving between Daniel's face and the trembling child at his side. Mark noticed the tension and stepped forward. "My friend didn't mean any harm," he said, laying a steadying hand on Daniel's shoulder. But his own eyes had shifted to the boy's overalls with visible recognition. "Our boys wore outfits just like that," Mark murmured. "Green overalls, yellow straps, long sleeves, identical." His voice carried the weight of memory, and for a moment the yard grew strangely quiet around them. The man looked down at his son. "I bought these at a department store months ago," he said. "I can't remember which one." He sounded sincere, but Daniel's gaze was locked on the fabric. "May I see the tag?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The man hesitated, glancing at the boy, then shook his head gently. "I think we've caused enough worry today." Mark offered a nod of apology, guiding Daniel away from the family. Conversations in the yard slowly resumed, but Daniel's mind was already far from the party, spinning through memories and unanswered questions. On the walk home, the summer air felt heavier than before. Inside, Daniel sat quietly on the couch while Mark fetched tea. The image of those overalls burned behind his eyes, refusing to fade. "I can't let it go," Daniel finally said. "I want to see the photographs again. The ones from that day." His voice was firm, the decision already made before the words left his mouth. Mark hesitated but agreed, disappearing into the attic. Minutes later, he returned with a dust-covered box. Inside lay a lifetime in fragments, toys, drawings, and finally, a leather-bound photo album. When they turned to the page, there they were. Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, standing shoulder to shoulder in green checkered overalls with yellow straps, smiling as if nothing could touch them. Taken the very morning they disappeared. Daniel studied the photograph with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. The brothers' green overalls were vivid, but his gaze drifted to the background, catching a glimpse of something metallic and unmistakably familiar. Just beyond the boys, half hidden by the frame, sat the gleaming front end of a cherry-red Cadillac. The same model Lucas had adored, the one he'd begged to ride in whenever possible. Mark leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's Mr. Howard Fielding's Cadillac," he said quietly. Howard had been the triplets' favorite teacher, patient, engaging, and known for keeping that car in pristine condition. Daniel frowned. But Howard moved away before this photo was taken. The school threw him a farewell party. I remember clearly. It was the day before. The timeline didn't fit, and the contradiction gnawed at him. If the car was there, then Howard had been in the neighborhood the morning the boys disappeared. Yet neither police reports nor witness statements had ever mentioned his presence. The absence of that detail felt intentional. Mark retrieved the original photo envelope from the box. The faded ink confirmed the film had been developed 2 days after the disappearance, cementing the date. The Cadillac's presence was no trick of memory. A cold wave washed over Daniel. If he was there that morning, he said slowly, then he saw something. Maybe even them. He couldn't ignore the possibility, however much he wanted the man's innocence to hold. Howard had been respected, trusted. Parents waved him through without a second thought. Could that trust have been misplaced? Could the man who once praised Lucas's reading and Noah's curiosity have taken everything from them? Mark urged caution. It could be another Cadillac, same year, same color, a coincidence. But Daniel shook his head. In their small community, there was only one car like that. Everyone knew it. The thought of calling the police crossed Daniel's mind, but 30 years had passed. Without new evidence beyond the photo, he feared the lead would be dismissed as a faded memory rather than a clue. Instead, he reached for another option. Someone who had known Howard well. An old colleague named Louise Mitchell, who had worked on the school board and might remember more about Howard's departure. Louise answered warmly, happy to reconnect. But when Daniel asked about Howard's career after leaving, the tone shifted. "He didn't transfer to another school," Louise explained. "Far as I know, he left the system entirely." According to Louise, Howard had moved to a rural part of Texas, starting a private farm for immigrant boys. The place was called Howard's Haven for Hope, operating quietly, but with a reputation for discipline. Daniel noted the name, his gut tightening. The farm's website listed no phone number, only an email and an address deep in the countryside. Photographs showed boys tending fields, caring for animals, and smiling for the camera. Howard appeared in a few images, older now, with silver hair and a weathered face, but the same posture, the same presence. He stood in the middle of the group like a watchful guardian. The address was less than 2 hours away. Daniel stared at it on the screen, the photo of the Cadillac burning in his thoughts. If answers existed, they might be found there. He sent an email introducing himself and asking to visit, but as he closed the laptop, he knew he wouldn't wait for a reply. 30 years had passed. He was done waiting. The gravel road to Howard's Haven for Hope stretched ahead, flanked by tall grasses swaying under the Texas sun. Daniel gripped the wheel, his jaw set, the photograph in his jacket pocket like a weight. The wooden sign came into view, its carved letters weathered but clear. The property beyond looked orderly. A white farmhouse, 2 barns, several cabins, and neat rows of crops running toward the horizon. A young man emerged from one of the barns, wiping his hands on worn jeans. His skin was sun-browned, his build lean and strong. "Can I help you, sir?" he called out. Daniel introduced himself, explaining he was an old acquaintance of Howard's from decades past. The young man nodded politely, then mentioned most staff and residents were away at a county agricultural event for the day. Still, he offered to give a quick tour. Daniel followed, taking in stables filled with horses, barns stocked with livestock, and fields lined with vegetables. Everything appeared wholesome, but the quietness felt unnatural, almost rehearsed. They reached a brightly painted barn meant for the younger boys. Inside, long tables held art supplies, craft projects, and half-finished drawings. The walls were covered in crayon rainbows, collages of leaves, and painted wooden figures. Near the back, a man in his late 30s arranged supplies. His hair was thick and dark, curling slightly at the ends. His smile was quick, wide, the kind that drew attention instantly. "Ferdinand," the guide said, "this is Daniel Rodriguez. He knew Mr. Fielding years ago." Ferdinand shook Daniel's hand, speaking warmly about the farm's programs and the creative projects for the children. Then Daniel noticed one particular piece of art, a detailed mosaic of a cherry-red Cadillac crafted with colored rice. The precision was startling compared to the others, the shape instantly recognizable. "That's Mr. Fielding's car," Ferdinand said proudly. "He still has it. Took it to the fair today." His voice was casual, but Daniel's pulse quickened. The Cadillac's presence was no coincidence anymore. Daniel looked closer at Ferdinand. The dark curls, the quick smile, the expressive way he moved his hands while speaking. It tugged at something deep in memory, something he hadn't felt in decades. Without thinking, Daniel asked, "Do you have brothers?" Ferdinand chuckled lightly. "Yeah. My brother's at the fair with Mr. Fielding, helping run our booth." The guide added that the two were inseparable. Daniel masked his reaction, but inside, the words reverberated. Brothers. The thought wouldn't let go. He thanked Ferdinand and followed the guide back toward the parking area, his mind racing with the possibilities. Before leaving, Daniel glanced over his shoulder. Ferdinand was still arranging supplies, that same easy smile on his face. It was a smile Daniel had seen before, in photographs worn thin from decades of handling. Back in the car, Daniel gripped the wheel. The fairgrounds were only a short drive away. If Ferdinand's brother was there, Daniel intended to see him, and maybe finally find the truth. The engine roared to life. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as Daniel turned toward the road. In his chest, the faint spark of hope began to burn hotter than it had in 30 years. Whatever waited at the county fair, he knew this. He wasn't walking away without answers. And if his instincts were right, the search for his sons was about to take a dangerous turn. The county fairgrounds sprawled with color, noise, and movement. Daniel parked on the edge of a dusty field, scanning rows of white tents, livestock pens, and food stalls, while music drifted from a distant wooden stage. He moved steadily through the crowd, eyes flicking across faces, searching for any sign of Howard or the young man Ferdinand had called his brother. The smell of roasted corn and barbecue hung heavy in the air. Then he saw it, a white tent with a blue banner, Howard's Haven for Hope. Standing just outside, speaking animatedly with a couple, was a silver-haired man Daniel recognized instantly despite the 30 years. Howard Fielding looked older, his hair fully white, his face lined. But the posture, the movements of his hands, and the faint smile, all the same as the man Daniel had once trusted with his sons. Daniel waited until Howard finished speaking with the couple, then approached. "Mr. Fielding," he said evenly. Howard turned, polite curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Daniel Rodriguez," he said. "Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel were my sons. They were in your class at Oak Ridge Elementary." Recognition slowly dawned in Howard's gaze, his expression softening into something almost warm. "Of course," Howard said, voice measured. "Bright boys. I was heartbroken when I heard what happened. Such a tragedy." Daniel's eyes didn't leave Howard's face. "We always thought you moved away to teach elsewhere." Howard shook his head. "No, I stayed in Texas, studied agriculture and child development, preparing for this place." He gestured toward the tent, his voice carrying the air of a man proud of his work. Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out the photograph. "This was taken the morning they disappeared. That's your Cadillac, isn't it?" His tone was calm, but beneath it lay a question that demanded an answer. Howard studied the picture for several seconds. His jaw tightened slightly. I can't remember the exact day, and I certainly don't recall driving through your neighborhood. That car must have belonged to someone else. Before Daniel could respond, movement caught his eye. A man weaving quickly through the crowd toward the tent. The hair was thick, dark, and curled like Ferdinand's, the resemblance impossible to ignore. The man reached Howard, and their exchange was tense, marked by sharp gestures. As he turned, Daniel's breath caught. It was like looking at Ferdinand's reflection, save for a few subtle differences. "This must be your brother," Daniel murmured under his breath. The man glanced in his direction briefly, then looked away, speaking low to Howard before both moved briskly toward the parking area. Daniel started forward but forced himself to stop. Mark's earlier words echoed in his head. Don't confront them without proof. If there were brothers here, perhaps there was a third somewhere else. He scanned the fairgrounds, hoping for another familiar face, but found nothing. Returning to Howard's booth, he saw only an older staff member packing supplies. When asked, the man smiled. "They're triplets, you know." Daniel froze. Triplets. The confirmation hit like a blow and a surge of hope at once. The man added casually, "The third works at Mr. Fielding's private estate, not far from here." The location was off limits. Confidential. But Daniel didn't need the address yet. Now he knew this. 3 young men, the right age, identical in a way only he could recognize. And Howard was at the center of it all. As Howard's Cadillac pulled away in the distance, Daniel felt the years of searching narrowing into this moment. For the first time since 1981, the possibility was real. His sons might finally be within reach. Daniel didn't waste time. He called the sheriff's department directly, his voice steady but urgent, explaining the cold case, the photo, and the triplets at Howard's farm. Dispatch promised to connect him with a detective immediately. Detective Martinez came on the line, his tone professional but attentive. Daniel relayed everything in detail: the photo with the Cadillac, the uncanny resemblance of Ferdinand and his brother, and the confirmation from staff they were triplets. Martinez instructed him not to confront Howard directly. "Stay in sight, but keep your distance. We're sending units to both the farm and the private estate. If your suspicion is correct, we'll confirm it quickly." Daniel and Mark returned to the car, parking discreetly near the farm's entrance. Minutes stretched like hours until 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled down the gravel road, lights flashing in the hot Texas afternoon. From their vantage point, Daniel saw Howard, Ferdinand, and the second brother loading duffel bags into the Cadillac. The urgency in their movements was unmistakable. They were leaving, and soon. Deputies blocked the driveway, stepping out with hands poised near their holsters. Howard raised his hands, his face caught between confusion and irritation, speaking rapidly to explain away the sudden departure. Ferdinand and the second brother stood off to the side, exchanging glances that were more uncertain than defiant. Daniel's eyes locked on them, the recognition in his chest growing heavier by the second. Unable to hold back, Daniel stepped from the car, the photograph in his grip. He walked toward the group, ignoring a deputy's request to stay back, his voice cutting through the tension. "These are my sons," he said, holding the photo high enough for all to see. "Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel Rodriguez. They disappeared on June 12, 1981. These 2 match them exactly." Ferdinand stared at the image, his brow furrowing. "That's me," he said slowly. The second brother stepped closer, pointing at himself in the picture. "And that's me. But we were told our parents were criminals." Howard snapped back sharply. "I saved you! You were abandoned!" His voice carried an edge of desperation, but the deputies were already stepping in closer, one producing handcuffs, while another called in updates over the radio. Daniel's voice cracked, but held firm. "You were taken from your own yard. You were loved. You were wanted. That man lied to you for your entire lives. The deputies moved Howard toward a cruiser, reading charges: kidnapping, unlawful restraint, identity fraud. His protests grew quieter with each step, his eyes burning into Daniel like a final warning. Inside the farmhouse, investigators found the Cadillac in a garage, its cherry-red paint faded but intact. In a locked drawer, they uncovered forged documents and 3 separate identities for the brothers, maintained for decades. Ferdinand was Lucas, the second brother was Noah, and the third, named Marco by Howard, was Gabriel, kept at the private estate, working with younger children and never allowed to the main farm. When Gabriel was recovered hours later, along with several other boys, he was physically unharmed, but wary. His eyes softened only when Daniel walked into the station, arms open, tears streaming without shame. The reunion was messy, loud, and unfiltered. 30 years of loss colliding with the shock of truth. They weren't healed, not yet. But for the first time in decades, they were all in the same room. Daniel knew the road ahead would be long. But for the first time since that summer afternoon in 1981, the search was over. His sons were found, and the lies that stole them had finally collapsed. The police station's interview room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Daniel sat at a metal table, fingers laced together, his mind replaying every moment of the day, barely believing what had unfolded. Detective Martinez entered, holding a folder. "Howard has confessed," he said. "He admitted taking the boys, forging identities, and keeping them under his control for years. He's facing multiple charges that will keep him in prison." Daniel exhaled slowly. The words were heavy, but they brought closure he'd been chasing for 3 decades. "Where are they now?" he asked, his voice steady, but brimming with anticipation. "They're here," Martinez said. "They know the truth. It may take time, but they want to see you." He stepped out, leaving the door open to the hallway beyond. Then they appeared. 3 men in their mid-30s, moving hesitantly. Lucas's smile was hesitant but warm. Noah's gaze was steady and searching. Gabriel hung back slightly, cautious but visibly moved. Daniel rose slowly, feeling his throat tighten. For years he'd imagined this moment, every detail, every possible reaction, yet nothing could prepare him for seeing them in flesh and blood again. Lucas stepped forward first, wrapping Daniel in a sudden, fierce hug. Noah followed, his grip firm, almost as if anchoring himself to a truth he'd only just discovered. Gabriel's approach was slower, his eyes glistening. Daniel reached out, and the youngest leaned in, resting his head against his father's shoulder for the first time since he was 6 years old. The 4 of them stood together, an embrace that seemed to erase years, yet carried the weight of everything lost. Daniel closed his eyes, committing the feel of each to memory. They talked quietly, voices low but urgent. Lucas asked about the house. Noah wanted to know about neighbors from the old block. Gabriel listened, occasionally glancing at his brothers as if to confirm this was real. Daniel told them about the birthdays, the search efforts, the photographs kept untouched for decades. He described the community that had never forgotten them, even when official searches had ended. Lucas admitted Howard had convinced them their parents were dangerous and gone forever. "We believed him," he said, voice breaking. "We didn't question it. We were just kids. We didn't know." Noah nodded. "He gave us rules, structure, food, work, but it was all under his control. Any questions, any pushback? It wasn't worth it. We just survived." Gabriel finally spoke. "I always felt something was missing. I didn't know what. But now I get it." His words were quiet, but the resolve in them was unshakable. Martinez returned, explaining the next steps: statements, counseling, legal proceedings. But for Daniel, the process ahead was less about courtrooms and more about rebuilding trust with 3 men who had been strangers hours earlier. That night they left the station together. Daniel drove them through the streets of Laredo, pointing out places from their childhood: the park, the old school, the corner store where they once bought candy. When they reached the Rodriguez home, Daniel led them inside. The living room walls were lined with photographs of their childhood. 3 small beds still stood in the spare room, preserved as if waiting. They walked through slowly, touching the furniture, the toys, the keepsakes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of years that could never be reclaimed, but didn't have to be forgotten. That night, under one roof for the first time in 30 years, Daniel lay awake, listening to the sound of their breathing down the hall. It was the sound of his world finally made whole again.